This video is brought to you by GiveWell. As Israel's assault on Gaza has escalated, Western support has duly waned. Even previously stalwart supporters like the UK and Germany have started calling for de-escalation, and other Western states like France and Spain have explicitly accused Israel of breaking international law. Throughout all this, the US has emerged as Israel's staunchest ally. While there have been reports that the US is privately counselling Israel to de-escalate, in public the Biden administration has been pretty steadfast in its support for Israel. While US President Joe Biden warned that Netanyahu was heading for diplomatic isolation on Tuesday, only a day earlier Biden said the US would continue to provide military assistance until Israel were rid of Hamas, and that his commitment to the safety of the Jewish people and the security of Israel, its right to exist as an independent Jewish state, is unshakable. US support for Israel has basically come in two forms: diplomatic support and military support. The clearest instance of diplomatic support has come at the UN, where the US has voted with Israel on every General Assembly resolution and single-handedly vetoed last week's Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. At that vote, only the UK abstained, and every other Security Council member, including France, Japan and Switzerland, voted in favour. In terms of military support, the US has provided copious amounts of ammunition to Israel, and last week US Secretary of State Antony Blinken invoked emergency powers to supply nearly 14,000 tank rounds to Israel, waiving the requirement to consult Congress under the Arms Export Control Act. While this support is sometimes dismissed as unnecessary, given that Israel already enjoys an enormous military advantage over Hamas, comments by Israeli officials suggest that US military aid has actually been instrumental in the assault on Gaza. In late November, a retired IDF general admitted that all of our ammunition is from the US, and that, quote, everyone understands that we can't fight this war without the United States. Now, America's steadfast support for Israel in these respects shouldn't come as a total surprise. After all, Israel is a long-time US ally, and Biden, a self-described Zionist, has been one of its most vocal congressional supporters since the 80s. The US has also vetoed over 40 Security Council draft resolutions concerning Israel in the past, including another one in October calling for humanitarian pauses in Gaza. Nonetheless, as international and domestic unease regarding Israel's assault on Gaza grows, and Israel continues to apparently ignore Biden's pleas for restraint, some analysts have suggested that it would be in America's interest to at least temper its support for Israel. So in this video, we're going to explain why the US has historically supported Israel, why the Gaza war is complicating relations, and why some people think America's absolute support for Israel is a mistake. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. As we see it, there are broadly three reasons the US supports Israel, and has done historically. First, it mirrors domestic public opinion. There's a large Jewish diaspora in the US, and large majorities of Americans on both sides of the political aisle have historically been pro-Israel. According to Gallup polling, net sympathy towards Israel hovered at around +50 for most of the 21st century, which essentially implies that 75% of Americans were pro-Israel. Second, the US-Israel alliance has a foreign policy rationale. The Middle East has always been an important region for the US, especially in the 20th century, and the US foreign policy establishment see Israel as a strategic foothold in a region that is otherwise pretty anti-American. This was especially true after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, where the pro-American Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, was replaced with the anti-American Ayatollah Khomeini. Third, in the context of the current crisis, some analysts have argued that the US's unflinching support for Israel is pragmatic, because Biden and co. know that Netanyahu is only going to listen to them if he trusts them, and the only way to win Netanyahu's trust is to support Israel absolutely. This is often known as the bear hug strategy, and its proponents point out that Israel hasn't been particularly receptive to criticism thus far. Israel reacted to Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's comments by recalling their envoy, and Israeli officials have dismissed UN resolutions calling for de-escalation as symptoms of the organisation's apparent anti-Israel bias. However, none of these three arguments hold as much water as they once did. First, domestic public opinion isn't quite as pro-Israel as it once was, especially amongst Democrats. Gallup polling from January of this year found that, while Republicans are still staunchly pro-Israel, independents are less sympathetic to Israel than ever before. And for the first time, Democrats' sympathies lie more with the Palestinians than the Israelis, 49% versus 38%. Remember, this was in January of this year, before the Gaza war, so chances are that perceptions of Israel have since declined further. In this light, Biden's unflinching support no longer really mirrors domestic opinion in the US, at least amongst Democrats, and it's become a real electoral risk for him. According to polling by the Arab American Institute, Biden's approval rating amongst Arab Americans has declined markedly, dropping from 74% in 2020 to 29% last month. This is yet more bad news for his re-election prospects, given that Arab voters could swing states like Michigan, Arizona, and Georgia. Second, the foreign policy rationale isn't quite as strong as it was in the 20th century, for two reasons. First, it looks like support for Israel is counterproductive, insofar as it's making the Middle East both more anti-American and arguably more unstable. But second, and perhaps more importantly, the Middle East is just less of a foreign policy priority for the US these days. Since at least the Obama presidency, the US has been trying to pivot away from the Middle East towards China and the Asia Pacific. Now, obviously, this pivot has only been moderately successful, because the US keeps getting dragged back to the Middle East and its never-ending crises. But as America's focus shifts towards China, its controversial alliance with Israel makes less and less geostrategic sense. It's also worth saying that Biden's support for Israel is actively undermining his other foreign policy interests, including Ukraine and China. America's apparent hypocrisy in condemning human rights violations in Ukraine, but not Gaza, has undermined international support for Ukraine, especially amongst the global south, and validated China's long-standing accusation that the US selectively appeals to human rights to advance its foreign policy interests. Third, Biden's bear hug strategy hasn't really worked. While the US has clearly been Israel's staunchest supporter, White House officials have on multiple occasions implored Israel to de-escalate. Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged Israel to stop settler violence in the West Bank and comply with international law. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin warned last month that Israel was heading to a strategic defeat if it continued with its maximalist strategy, and Vice President Kamala Harris said earlier this month that Israel must do more to protect innocent civilians. In a rare public criticism on Tuesday, Biden himself warned Netanyahu that what he described as Israel's indiscriminate bombing risked isolating Israel politically. While it remains to be seen whether Biden's recent comments will provoke a change in Israeli strategy, those previous comments by Blinken and Austin had no impact, and Israeli Minister Shlomo Karhi has already dismissed other comments made on Tuesday calling for a two-state solution, which doesn't bode well for the White House. This is most likely a reflection of Israel's domestic politics. Netanyahu doesn't have the political space to de-escalate because his government relies on a handful of super hawkish right-wing ministers who won't accept any concessions. By the way, this also isn't good news for Biden domestically, because his inability to restrain the Israelis makes him look impotent and irritates the majority of Americans who want America out of the Middle East. So you get the idea. Supporting Israel has become a real risk for the US, which probably explains why Biden has finally criticised Israel in public. So does this mean US policy towards Israel is likely to change? Well, it doesn't look immediately likely, given Biden and Trump's pro-Israel instincts. But if current trends continue, America's absolute support for Israel will come under increasing pressure. There are over 1.5 million non-profit organisations in the US, and millions more around the world. So how do you know which ones make the biggest impact with your donations? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They spend tens of thousands of hours poring over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-based organisations that are saving and improving lives. In fact, GiveWell has now spent over 15 years researching charitable organisations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. That's things like preventative malaria treatment for about $7, which can reduce malaria infections and, with enough treatments, save lives in expectation. Together, over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $1 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 150,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. In fact, in 2019, when we sold TLDR-branded pin badges for charity, we turned to GiveWell to help select the charities we donated to, ensuring the maximum impact of our giving. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. As such, you can find all their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. Plus, if you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org, pick YouTube and enter TLDR News at checkout. Do make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from TLDR News in order to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.